Imagine waking up in the pitch black of a cave, the air thick with smoke from a fire that barely keeps the cold away. The walls drip with moisture, insects crawl freely across the ground, and just beyond the entrance, predators are waiting for the first sign of weakness. Now picture calling that home day after day, year after year. The Stone Age wasn't just about hunting mammoths and painting on walls. It was about surviving in places you and I would never dare to live. When we think of the Stone Age, it's easy to picture caves as safe havens, warm fires flickering on walls decorated with paintings, families huddled together, sheltered from the outside world. But the reality, it was far darker, colder, and far more terrifying than we'd ever want to imagine. Step inside a typical cave home, and the first thing you'd notice is the darkness. There were no windows, no natural light deep inside, just shadows that twisted and stretched with every flicker of the fire. That same fire, the one thing standing between survival and freezing to death, filled the air with choking smoke. Imagine trying to sleep while your lungs burned, your eyes watered, and your throat felt like sandpaper. The moisture made everything worse. Caves were damp, with water dripping from ceilings and pooling on the ground. The constant humidity bred bacteria, mold, and diseases. Clothing and bedding, if you even had any, never truly dried. The ground itself was cold and hard, sucking the warmth from your body as you slept. And then there were the unwanted roommates. Insects crawled across the cave floor, rodents scurried in the shadows, and bats swooped overhead. Parasites thrived in such conditions, spreading illnesses that would have been deadly without medicine. Your home was a breeding ground for sickness. But perhaps the greatest threat came from outside. A cave wasn't a private house. It was a contested piece of real estate. Bears, lions, hyenas, massive predators of the Ice Age also saw caves as ideal shelters. At any moment, your family might find themselves face to face with a hungry beast returning to claim its lair. Survival wasn't guaranteed even within your so-called home. So while caves may sound like nature's gift of ready-made housing, the truth is they were suffocating, disease-ridden, and extremely dangerous. For Stone Age humans, moving into a cave was less about comfort and more about choosing the lesser evil, because, outside, the cold night could kill you even faster. Living in a cave wasn't just uncomfortable, it reshaped every part of daily life. From the moment you woke up to the moment you tried to sleep, survival dictated your every move. Imagine starting the day in pitch darkness, fumbling to keep the fire alive before the cold crept in. Food wasn't stored in cupboards or baskets. It was hung high to keep it away from scavengers, or buried in the cold dirt to delay rotting. Even then, the smell of blood or meat carried through the cave, luring predators closer. Every meal was a risk, a signal flare, inviting danger right to your doorstep. Then came the issue of sanitation. With no proper waste disposal, caves quickly became filthy. Human waste, animal bones, and decaying scraps piled up, and the stench was overwhelming. Disease spread easily in these close, unhygienic quarters, especially among children and the elderly. Imagine being trapped inside during a storm. Everyone huddled together, breathing the same smoky, contaminated air, while sickness spread silently among them. Noise was another constant enemy. The crackle of fire, the dripping of water, the echo of voices, and the movements of unseen creatures outside kept the mind on edge. Sleep wasn't restful. It was shallow, broken, always interrupted by fear. At any moment, a growl or a sudden crash at the cave mouth could mean death. Despite these horrors, caves offered one crucial advantage: protection from the elements. Blizzards, storms, and freezing nights outside could kill within hours, and inside, even with all the filth, smoke, and danger people stood a better chance of surviving. It was a desperate calculation. Suffer inside or die outside. But here's the haunting thought. Humans didn't just endure this for days or weeks. Entire generations grew up in these conditions. Childhoods spent in darkness, youth shaped by fear, families forced into constant vigilance. For them, the cave wasn't a nightmare, it was normal life. As dreadful as cave living was, it also shaped human culture in ways we still see echoes of today. Out of the darkness and danger, people found ways to adapt, not just physically, but mentally and spiritually. The walls of caves, for example, became canvases of survival. Early humans painted animals, hunts, and symbols, images that served as both storytelling and ritual. To us, they look like beautiful ancient art. To them, these paintings may have been more than decoration. Perhaps prayers for a successful hunt, warnings for the next generation, or attempts to make sense of a world filled with fear. The cave itself became not just a shelter, but a sacred space. Communities also grew around the shared struggle of living in these conditions. Families huddled together for warmth, relying on one another in ways that strengthened bonds. Survival wasn't an individual effort, it was collective. One person tended the fire, another kept watch at the entrance, while others cared for children or prepared food. The constant threats forged a sense of unity, because one person's mistake could mean disaster for all. And yet, the horror never truly went away. Every scrape of rock, every flicker of shadow kept people on edge. Imagine sitting in the dark, staring at the cave mouth, knowing that out there lurked lions, wolves, and rival tribes, any one of them ready to attack. This tension seeped into the human psyche, fueling myths, fears, and the very beginnings of spiritual thought. Caves, in a sense, were both home and prison. They offered safety but demanded sacrifice. They nurtured culture but carried the constant reminder of mortality. For early humans, calling a cave home was less about comfort and more about endurance, living with the unlivable, finding meaning in misery, and holding on just long enough to see another sunrise. So, while we might look at caves today with fascination, the people who lived there knew them for what they were: a nightmare you couldn't escape, but had no choice but to survive. Escaping the darkness of caves may sound like progress, but what came next wasn't much better. In fact, the first man-made shelters were often just as miserable, sometimes even worse. Imagine leaving the cold, dripping walls of a cave only to move into a hut made from animal bones, rotting hides, and sticks. That was the reality for many early humans. One of the earliest known houses came from mammoth bones, stacked together like a skeletal frame. Skins were stretched over the bones to form walls, and branches filled the gaps. From a distance, it may have looked like an impressive feat of survival engineering, but step inside, and you'd find a nightmare. The air was damp, the stench of animal fat and blood hung everywhere, and the hides rotted quickly, attracting swarms of flies. Without proper ventilation, the smoke from a central fire filled the cramped space until breathing became a choking struggle. And then there was the problem of fragility. Unlike caves, these shelters had no solid rock to protect their inhabitants. A strong storm, heavy snow, or even a curious predator could bring the structure crashing down. Imagine huddling inside during a blizzard, listening to the walls creak and sag, praying the whole thing wouldn't collapse on top of you. The ground beneath was no less cruel. With no raised floors, families slept directly on dirt or animal skins. Insects, vermin, and dampness crept in nightly, spreading disease. Rain turned the floor to mud. In winter, frostbite was a constant threat. In summer, infestations made life unbearable. And yet, for all their flaws, these primitive shelters marked something important. Humanity's first real attempt to control the environment. For the first time, people weren't just taking what nature gave them, they were building, experimenting, and reshaping the world around them. It was progress, yes, but progress built on suffering. Inside these bond-and-hide shelters, life was far from the image of cozy family living. Every day was a battle against decay, disease, and the elements. Start with hygiene, the complete lack of it. The walls of animal skins soaked up smoke, grease, and bodily odors, turning the entire shelter into a suffocating chamber of stench. Without fresh air circulation, diseases spread quickly, especially respiratory illnesses from the constant inhalation of smoke. Children grew up coughing, wheezing, and fighting off fevers that we today would consider preventable, but back then could easily be deadly. Then there were the pests. Rotting hides attracted flies in swarms, laying eggs that hatched into maggots wriggling through the living space. Fleas and lice thrived in the bedding of animal skins, crawling onto human bodies and spreading parasites. Imagine trying to sleep with your skin constantly itching, knowing that every movement around you meant another insect crawling in the dark. Repairs were another endless struggle. These shelters were fragile, requiring constant patching and reinforcement. Strong winds could tear through animal hides, while heavy rains turned roofs into dripping messes. Families had to scramble daily to mend holes, replace sagging branches, or restretch hides. Failure to do so meant waking up drenched, freezing, or even buried under a collapsed wall. Food storage added yet another layer of horror. With no reliable preservation methods, meat rotted fast, filling the air with rancid smells that not only made life unbearable, but also drew predators closer. Wolves, hyenas, and even bears would circle campsites, sniffing out weakness. At night, the sounds of scratching, growling, or distant howls were a grim reminder that these flimsy shelters offered little true protection. And yet, for all the misery, early humans endured. Why? Because these huts gave them something caves never could: mobility. They could be built, abandoned, and rebuilt as groups followed migrating herds. That freedom came at a high cost, but it laid the foundation for humanity's restless, inventive spirit. As dreadful as these fragile huts were, they carried one powerful consequence. They changed the way humans lived together. Unlike caves, which were limited in space and location, these portable shelters allowed families and small groups to form camps, creating the earliest sense of villages. In these clusters of bone, mud, and hide, humans learned what it meant to share space not just with family, but with neighbors. Fires were placed at the center of camps, tools were made and traded, and food was sometimes shared for survival. But close living also meant shared suffering. When one shelter caught disease, parasites, or infestation, it quickly spread to the rest. A single weak structure collapsing in a storm could leave an entire family exposed to the elements, forcing the community to step in. Survival wasn't just personal anymore. It was collective. These conditions also fueled the beginnings of ritual and belief. Living in constant fear of storms, predators, and death, people sought meaning in the chaos. Bones that built their shelters sometimes doubled as sacred objects. Fires weren't just for warmth, they became symbols of life, protection, and even spirituality. The very act of constructing a hut may have carried ritualistic importance, turning necessity into tradition. But perhaps the most important legacy of these shelters was innovation. Every collapse, every infestation, every hardship forced humans to think, how can this be built better? Over generations, they experimented with new materials, adding mud for insulation, stacking stones for stability, weaving branches for strength. What began as miserable bone huts would, slowly but surely, evolve into sturdier, more permanent homes. In a sense, these shelters represent the painful but necessary bridge between nature's prisons and humanity's future. They were crude, foul, and barely protective, yet they gave our ancestors the first taste of control over their environment. Out of smoke-filled huts, swarming pests, and collapsing roofs, the seeds of architecture were sown. The homes were horrifying, but they were also the start of everything. When we look back at the Stone Age, it's tempting to imagine it as a time of adventure hunts across open plains, firelit storytelling, and cave paintings that still spark our imagination today. But the truth of their homes tells a much darker story. Caves, with their suffocating smoke, dripping walls, and ever-present predators, were less like safe havens and more like claustrophobic prisons. The earliest man-made shelters, built from bones, mud, and hides, gave humans mobility and freedom, but at the cost of constant infestations, disease, and collapse. These were not homes in the sense we understand them today. They were survival machines, temporary shields against a world that wanted you dead at every turn. And yet through this misery, something extraordinary happened. Humans adapted. They learned to transform suffering into progress. Every cough from smoke-filled lungs, every collapse during a storm, every sleepless night scratching at flea bites pushed us forward. Those crude shelters lit the spark of innovation, leading to the sturdy homes, cities, and civilizations we now take for granted. It's humbling, isn't it? To think that the cozy bedroom you're sitting in, with its walls, windows, and roof that never leaks, is the product of thousands of years of human struggle against horrifying conditions. What our ancestors endured would drive most of us mad in a matter of days. But for them, it was life. And out of that life came the foundation of everything we are today. So the next time you complain about a leaky faucet, a broken heater, or even just a noisy neighbor, remember the Stone Age homes. Remember the caves filled with smoke and fear, the bone huts crawling with insects, and the fragile shelters that barely kept death away. And maybe, just maybe, you'll feel a little gratitude for the four walls you call home. If you enjoyed this journey into the darker side of human history, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more stories from the past, and share your thoughts in the comments. Would you have survived a Stone Age home? Or would it have horrified you into running back into the wild?